Have you ever wondered why a man begins to tremble inside when the woman before him suddenly stops reacting? For so long he has drawn strength from her responses, the spark in her eyes, the sting in her words, the rhythm of her emotions. Her laughter inflated him, her anger fed him, her tears even made him feel powerful. Every sigh, every question, every plea was a thread tethering him to her world. But when those threads are cut, when silence falls like a stone into still water, he finds himself adrift. The absence of her reaction does not bring him peace, it brings him panic. For the male psyche, reaction is confirmation. It tells him that he exists, that his presence has weight, that his choices echo in someone else's soul. Without that reflection, he feels the abyss open beneath him. Jung would call this moment a collision with shadow, the unveiling of the hidden truth. That much of his identity has been built not on who he is, but on how she mirrors him. When she ceases to mirror, he must confront himself. And often, what he sees there terrifies him. A woman's silence to the unready man is not quiet, it is thunder. He senses in it a withdrawal of life force, a refusal to play the game of reaction that sustained his ego. Suddenly, the theatre of dominance crumbles. His role as the powerful one, the mover, the one who dictates, revealed as illusion. For in truth, power was never his alone. It depended on her energy, her engagement, her willingness to dance in his storm. Without her participation, the storm dies. And so he wonders, in confusion, what does her silence mean? Is it hatred? Is it indifference? Is it punishment? He scours her stillness for clues, yet finds nothing. He begins to realize that silence is not empty. It is full of her reclaiming her boundaries, her dignity, her time. She is no longer leaking her energy into arguments, explanations, or desperate attempts to make him see. She is conserving it, treasuring it, guarding it as sacred. This moment marks a rupture in the dynamic between man and woman, one that history itself has rarely prepared him for. For centuries, women were conditioned to respond, to soothe, to serve as mirrors for male identity. A man's rage was met with a woman's trembling compliance, his withdrawal with her pursuit, his arrogance with her persuasion. But now, she no longer reacts. She no longer dances in that old script, and so he feels the hollow inside himself expand, unmasked by the stillness of her presence. Do you see how powerful this is? When you, as a woman, stop explaining, stop defending, stop endlessly proving, you alter the entire structure of the relationship. You reclaim the role of chooser, no longer the responder. And in that shift, his unconscious awakens in terror. Because silence does not simply mean withdrawal from him, it means she has returned to herself. To the unawakened man, this silence feels like cruelty. But to the one who dares to face his own shadow, it becomes a teacher. He sees for the first time how fragile his ego has been, how desperately he depended on her reactions to uphold his sense of self. And he faces the task Jung spoke of, individuation, the breaking apart of illusion in order to build a self that is not dependent on another's constant reflection, but rooted in inner truth. The silence of a woman thus divides men. The weak collapse into fear, searching for another mirror, another woman to react, another voice to fill the void. But the strong, the rare, begin to listen. They hear in her silence the invitation to meet themselves, to recognize the shadow that has always been there, fear of abandonment, terror of irrelevance, the ache of inadequacy. Her silence is not rejection, it is revelation. It shows him the truth he has always hidden from himself. And for her, he begins to wander the corridors of his mind, pacing like a prisoner suddenly aware of his chains. Where once he could depend on her voice to echo back his own, now he is left in the silence of his own thoughts. And silence, for a man unprepared, is unbearable. It is not neutral. It is a mirror turned inward, reflecting every crack in the armor he wears. The masculine ego, as Jung described, often builds itself upon conquest and affirmation. He conquers a woman's attention, he earns a reaction, he believes himself powerful. But when the reaction disappears, when her eyes no longer rise and fall at his movements, he feels a strange diminishment, as though a piece of his existence has been withdrawn. His entire mythology collapses. He cannot easily admit it, but deep within, he feels, if she no longer reacts, do I still matter? The mind of such a man turns restless. He replays the past, searching for where the thread broke. He remembers the arguments, the moments when she pleaded for him to listen, when she poured out her feelings like an offering at his feet. At the time, he dismissed it, satisfied with her emotional labor. But now, faced with her refusal, he sees those moments differently. They were not weakness. They were gifts. Gifts he took for granted. And gifts, once withdrawn, do not easily return. To you, listening now, consider this. What power lies in no longer fueling the dynamic? When you withhold reaction, you create space. You remind him, and yourself, that your energy is not currency for his ego. You become the still water he cannot ripple. That stillness unnerves him, for it forces him to realize that his actions are no longer the center of your world. He is left standing before a void, and in that void, he must meet himself. In that silence, shadows surface. He remembers the times he felt small, invisible, inadequate. Perhaps his father never saw him. Perhaps the world dismissed him. And so, unconsciously, he sought a woman's reaction to affirm his existence. Each argument, each tear, each sigh was a confirmation that he mattered, that he was real. But without that, he confronts the haunting suspicion. Perhaps I am nothing without her energy. Here lies the heart of his turmoil. For men, silence can feel like annihilation. But for women, silence can feel like rebirth. She begins to breathe again, no longer entangled in constant justification. Her heart, once consumed with defending its truth, begins to rest, and in that rest, she grows luminous. She discovers that she does not need to shout to be heard, nor plead to be loved. Her very refusal to react is her declaration. I will not spend myself where I am not honored. This reversal unsettles him deeply. He begins to sense her absence not as emptiness, but as fullness, a fullness that excludes him. She is radiant without his acknowledgement. She walks in her own orbit. She no longer bends to his moods, nor answers his provocations, and in her detachment, he feels the weight of his own dependency. His hunger for control is unmasked as weakness. His craving for reaction is revealed as addiction. Jung spoke of the anima, the feminine image that dwells in the male unconscious. When a woman withdraws her reactions, he can no longer project his anima onto her so easily. She ceases to be the screen for his shadow, and instead becomes untouchable, almost archetypal. He begins to see her not as an object of conquest, but as a force beyond him, one he cannot command. This realization can terrify him, but it can also awaken him. For the first time, he may sense that her value was never in her response, but in her being. And yet, not all men will face this. Many will flee from the silence, desperate to find another woman willing to react, to mirror, to feed. They will move on quickly, not realizing they are carrying the same wound into the next embrace. But some, those who dare to wrestle with their shadow, will stay. They will sit in the discomfort, the raw ache of irrelevance, and ask the question they once avoided. Who am I when no one reacts to me? The answer to that question marks the threshold of growth. If he can endure the silence, if he can build a self not dependent on her reactions but rooted in his own essence, then there comes a moment when his confusion sharpens into fear. Not the fear of losing her body, he may still possess that in proximity, but the fear of losing her spirit, her essence, the light that once revolved around him. For when a woman no longer reacts, it is not merely the withdrawal of words or gestures. It is the quiet erasure of the pedestal he stood upon. He feels himself shrinking, no longer a king in her kingdom, but a wanderer at the gates of her inner citadel. This shift is not trivial. It strikes at the ancient dance between masculine and feminine energies, a dance older than language itself. The masculine thrives on polarity, pursuit, conquest, dominion. The feminine, when reactive, feeds this pursuit, confirming his power. But when she ceases to respond, the polarity collapses. He is left chasing shadows, punching the air, longing for a spark that no longer ignites. Some men respond with anger. They rage, they provoke, they escalate, thinking intensity will shake her into motion again. But anger, in the absence of her reaction, turns inward. It becomes self-consuming. Others retreat into coldness, pretending indifference, hoping she will break the silence and return to her old patterns. Yet this too crumbles with time, for she has stepped onto a different plane. The woman who no longer reacts has entered a higher ground of self-possession, where his strategies no longer hold sway. For her, this stage is not merely withdrawal, it is awakening. The silence she inhabits is not empty, it is sacred. It is the silence of temples, of ancient forests, of midnight skies. Within it, she begins to hear herself again. She realizes how much energy she once poured into the cycle of reaction, defending, explaining, justifying, proving. She sees how much of her life force was spent trying to make him see her truth. And now, she claims it back. She lets it flow inward, like rivers returning to the ocean. To the man, however, this new silence carries the weight of judgment. He interprets it as condemnation, as if every unspoken word accuses him. But in reality, her silence is not about him at all. It is about her freedom. This is perhaps the hardest truth for him to face. That her detachment is not a tactic, not a weapon, not even revenge. It is liberation. She is no longer playing the game at all. When he looks at her now, he sees something uncanny. She is present, but untouchable. She listens without being pulled in. She sees without being swayed. Her eyes, once full of fire in arguments, now reflect something colder, calmer, like a still lake that reveals his reflection back to him. And what he sees there unsettles him. For the first time, he is forced to face the man he truly is, without the distortion of her emotional responses to shield him. This confrontation with himself is the crucible. Jung spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating the shadow. Here, the man is given an opportunity. In her silence, his shadow emerges. His neediness, his fragility, his hunger for validation. These rise like smoke, undeniable. He can run from them, project them onto another woman, or numb them with distraction, or he can confront them, integrate them, and become more than the sum of his wounds. But that choice is his alone. For the woman, however, the journey is different. She has already stepped beyond the need to manage his process. She is no longer chained to whether he learns or resists. Her silence says, "Your growth is yours, my peace is mine." This separation is a radical act of self-respect. It is the breaking of an ancient cycle where women carried the emotional burdens of men, trying to fix, heal, or rescue them through endless reaction. In choosing silence, she refuses that inheritance. And yet, her silence is not cruel. It is not an abandonment of love, but a recentering of love within herself. It is a declaration that her life energy is not a currency to be spent proving her worth. She no longer dances to the rhythm of his moods. She dances to her own. He, standing on the edge of this revelation, begins to sense that what he thought was loss is in fact initiation. Her silence is not a wall, but a threshold. If he dares to step through it, if he dares to meet himself without her emotional mirror, he might finally learn what it means to stand as a man. Not propped up by. There is a profound irony in this shift. The very thing he once believed made him strong, her constant emotional engagement, is revealed as his crutch. When she no longer reacts, the scaffolding collapses. He is left standing alone, and only then does he realize how much of his identity was stitched together by her responses. Without them, he must now answer a question he has avoided his whole life. Who am I when no woman reflects me? This question terrifies him because it strips away the illusions of control. Many men, shaped by culture and ego, have learned to measure their worth by the sway they hold over women. Their ability to inspire passion, to provoke jealousy, to command attention. When she no longer reacts, all of that dissolves. He is no longer affirmed by her fire, no longer defined by her storm. He is faced with the stark silence of himself. And here is where Jung's psychology cuts deepest. The man realizes that his hunger for her reaction was never truly about her. It was about the parts of himself he had buried, the shadow he projected outward, her anger, her tears, her laughter. These were mirrors reflecting his own denied emotions. She carried them for him, embodied them for him, lived them on his behalf. Without her reaction, the mirror shatters. Now he must feel what he once outsourced. In this sense, the woman's silence is both a death and a birth. For him, it feels like abandonment, but symbolically, it is initiation. It is the moment when the boy within him is forced to confront the man he has yet to become. He cannot reach her with the tricks of old, guilt, persuasion, charm, or force. Those keys no longer fit. If he desires to walk beside her again, he must unlock himself. But the woman does not wait at the door. She has walked through it already, into the vast field of her own becoming. In her stillness, she begins to touch something eternal. She sees how little her worth ever depended on his acknowledgement. She tastes the air of sovereignty, and it is intoxicating. She understands now that reaction was a chain, tethering her to his moods and wounds. The absence of reaction is freedom, the ability to choose when, where, and to whom her energy flows. And here is the paradox that unsettles him most. In her silence, she grows more magnetic, not less. Because nothing is more powerful than a woman who does not need to prove, explain, or defend. Her energy becomes concentrated, like a star that no longer leaks its light but burns with steady brilliance. Men sense this. They feel the shift in her aura, the way she no longer bends to the weight of their expectations. Some are drawn closer, desperate to touch that mystery. Others recoil, threatened by a power they cannot command. To him, the one who once fed on her reactions, this power is both terrifying and irresistible. He thinks, what does she see now that I cannot touch? What world has she entered where my voice no longer defines the air she breathes? He feels like an exile from her kingdom, watching as she reigns over herself with a quiet majesty he cannot unseat. This is when the temptations arise. He may seek to provoke her one last time, to break her silence, to make her prove she still cares. He may bait her with accusations, with absences, with sudden gestures of affection. He may even try to remind her of old wounds, pressing on scars to elicit a flinch. But the woman who no longer reacts has learned the alchemy of detachment. His attempts dissolve against her like waves against rock. What he does not yet understand is that her silence is not a rejection of love. It is a redefinition of it. Love, to her now, is no longer about losing herself in his storms. It is about standing in her center and allowing love to flow only where it uplifts, not where it drains. She realizes that true love does not demand endless reaction. True love requires presence, respect, and growth. And so, his mind circles endlessly around the mystery. What does it mean? There comes a moment when the man finally sees the silence, not as punishment, but as revelation. In that stillness, he confronts the truth. Her withdrawal was never about withholding love. It was about refusing to bleed herself dry for a man who would not face his own darkness. What he thinks in this moment is not spoken aloud, for it carries the weight of recognition that shatters pride. She was never mine to command. She was always her own. And this realization burns. It burns because it unmasks the illusion he built his identity upon, that her emotional world existed in orbit around him. When that illusion dies, he feels the abyss of his own unhealed self. No longer can he measure his worth by the fire in her eyes when he provoked her, or the softness in her voice when she soothed him. He must meet himself without her reactions as a mirror. And for many men, this feels like annihilation. But for the woman, it is liberation. Her silence is not absence, it is fullness. It is the fullness of a cup no longer tipped over to quench someone else's thirst. It is the fullness of a heart that finally beats without chains. She discovers that her essence was never meant to be consumed by his hunger. In not reacting, she has returned to herself, and in returning to herself, she has become untouchable. This is the juncture where the masculine psyche splits. Some men will interpret her silence as contempt and recoil further into defensiveness, anger, or retreat. They will call her cold, accuse her of cruelty, even project betrayal onto her. But beneath those accusations lies fear, the fear that she has risen into a realm they cannot reach without their own initiation. Other men, however, feel the crack of awakening. They sense that her silence is not rejection, but invitation. Not an invitation to reclaim control, but an invitation to meet her in her sovereignty by claiming their own. For Jung teaches that the outer world reflects the inner, and if she no longer reacts, it is because she has dissolved the need to validate his shadow. If he is to meet her again, it must be as a man who has faced himself. And what does a man think in this moment, when confronted by a woman who no longer reacts? He thinks of all the times he mistook her passion for weakness, her emotional intensity for instability. He begins to realize those storms were her gift, the way she carried not only her own soul, but the weight of his disowned emotions. Now he sees the void left behind when she refuses to carry them any longer. In this void, he encounters silence not as emptiness, but as sacred space. Silence becomes the mirror he once feared. It shows him his addictions, to control, to affirmation, to being the center of her world. And as the Stoics taught, to lose one's illusions is to suffer, but it is also the beginning of wisdom. For Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." When she no longer reacts, he learns this truth firsthand. The pain he feels is not her silence. It is the collapse of the meaning he gave to her reactions. And in that collapse, something new is born. He may, for the first time, ask himself, what does it mean to love a woman not for how she reacts to me, but for who she is in her essence? What does it mean to meet her not as a consumer of her energy, but as a companion in her freedom? If he can endure the silence without fleeing, he may begin to grow. For silence is not her weapon, but her sanctuary. To join her there, he must enter his own. He must face the loneliness he once disguised beneath her attention. He must feel the emptiness he once filled with her emotional labor. He must walk through the desert of himself until he discovers the oasis within. And here lies the paradox. When a man accepts her silence and meets it with his own inner work, he no longer fears it. He no longer needs her reaction to prove his existence. He learns, perhaps for the first time, to exist on his own terms. And in doing so, he becomes capable of meeting her as she is, sovereign, whole, unchained. For the woman, there is no turning back. Once she has tasted the freedom of non-reaction, she will not return to chains. She will not trade her stillness for the turbulence of appeasing his shadow. She will only walk beside the man who has learned to walk beside himself. And so, when a man thinks of the woman who no longer reacts, his thoughts are haunted and hallowed alike. Haunted by the echo of her silence, hallowed by the possibility of his own transformation. For in her quiet, he glimpses the profound truth. Love is not reaction, it is recognition. And so, the story reaches its inevitable transformation. The silence that once unnerved him becomes the crucible in which both souls are tested. She stands in her wholeness, untethered from his projections, no longer pulled into the storm of his insecurities. He, if willing, must face the silence not as rejection, but as rebirth. For silence is not the end of dialogue. It is the beginning of truth. In this moment, what does a man truly think when a woman no longer reacts? At first, despair. He feels like he has lost the power to move her, to make her flinch, to ignite her passion through conflict. He thinks he has lost control. But as the silence deepens, another thought begins to dawn, one he has long avoided. Perhaps she was never his to control. Perhaps her reactions were never proof of his significance, but proof of her compassion. And now, stripped of those reactions, he must meet his own insignificance with open eyes. This is where men either fracture or awaken. The fractured cling tighter to illusions, seeking another woman who will mirror back their worth, repeating the same cycle until life humbles them. But the awakened man pauses. He reflects. He dares to step into the abyss of self-discovery. For in her silence, he begins to hear his own voice, the voice buried beneath ego and shadow, the voice that has long begged for healing. And what of the woman? For her, silence is no longer emptiness. It is fullness, as if every ounce of energy once poured outward has returned home. She no longer seeks validation in his eyes, nor bends herself to soothe his wounds. She has become sovereign, her worth untouchable, her spirit radiant with self-possession. The silence is not punishment, but protection. It shields her from the exhaustion of being consumed and allows her to walk in her own light. Jung wrote of individuation as the sacred task of integrating the shadow, of becoming whole by embracing the unclaimed parts of the self. In this dance of silence, individuation manifests in living flesh. For the man, it is the mirror forcing him to see the shadow he projected onto her. For the woman, it is the shedding of chains that kept her bound to roles of caretaker and reflector. In the absence of reaction, both are called to face themselves. And this is the paradox. The silence that felt like death becomes the soil of rebirth. The man, if he dares to stay, begins to think not of how to control her, but how to know himself. He begins to recognize that her power was never in her words, but in her refusal to be diminished. He begins to see that love cannot be demanded, only chosen. And if she no longer reacts, it is because she has chosen herself above all else. For her, the silence is a sanctuary. It is where she rediscovers her laughter, her dreams, her wildness. It is where she remembers that she is not defined by his recognition, nor diminished by his neglect. She becomes as still and as vast as a mountain lake, reflecting only what she wishes, holding within her depths a serenity no storm can disturb. And so, the final thought emerges. What a man thinks when a woman no longer reacts is ultimately a reflection of who he is. If he is ruled by shadow, he sees her silence as betrayal. If he is ruled by ego, he sees it as a challenge to reclaim control. But if he is awakening, he sees it as sacred space, an invitation to meet himself, to rise into his own wholeness, and perhaps to meet her anew on equal ground.